I'd like to welcome you all to this, what was hoped to be the third in a series of lectures on teaching in the university. I would like first to apologize for what took place last week for those of you who were here, and that the Speaker of the Assembly, Mr. Unruh, was unable to make the airplane which would have brought him to the lecture because of pressing business in the Assembly. He sent his regrets at 3:45, and I lost the foot race with the secretary in the Education Department to get down to announce this to you. And if it interrupted or disturbed anyone's plans, by the GSA and the Graduate Division are very, very sorry. Today, we have the honor of having Professor Fred Rudolph from Williams College as the third speaker in the series. And next week will be an open date. The following weeks will be filled one a week through some date in April. Following this lecture, for those of you who are interested, at 7:30 in, I believe, room 2408 of the Student Union, Professor Rudolph will be glad to seminar, to answer specific questions and talk over some of the problems he has presented, and I'm sure he will, in his talk today. I'd now like to ask Dean Mark Curtis from the Graduate Division to come up and introduce Professor Rudolph.
Thank you, Charles. Ladies and gentlemen, it's with great pleasure that I introduce an old friend of mine, Professor Frederick Rudolph, who's presently on leave of absence from Williams College, where he's a professor of history. Professor Rudolph did his undergraduate work at the college where he now teaches, Williams, in Williamstown, Massachusetts, and then later, after service in the Army during the war, attended graduate school at Yale University, where he did work in history under Professor Ralph Gabriel. His dissertation, which was a history of a part of the life of his alma mater, Williams College, won a prize for the outstanding dissertation of the year in which he got his degree, and was subsequently published as Mark Hopkins and the Log. Since then, Professor Rudolph has extended his interests in the history of higher education in the United States and has published a work that's won widespread recognition in universities and circles of people generally who are concerned with problems of higher education. Its title is The American College and University, A History. Professor Rudolph will speak to us this afternoon on some aspects of, or some historical perspectives, perhaps would be a better way to put it, on teaching in American colleges and universities since the foundation of institutions of higher education in our country, and will, by that means, I think, enable us to get more balance and perspective on the contemporary situation with respect to this problem. It gives me great pleasure to introduce to you at this time Professor Frederick Rudolph.
Thank you very much, Dean Curtis. It's a very great pleasure to be here today and to have left all of the fog and snow of the east behind me this morning. Now, although some of my best friends are professors, I have no doubt about whether I'm going to have some difficulty telling you what teaching in an American college and university has been all about all these years. My difficulty is not going to be lessened by the knowledge that you already have a pretty good idea. You know some professors, and you have had a great deal of help from the modern novel in the contemporary stage. Take Edward Albee's Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, for example. As you know, this long play takes place in the living room of a house on the campus of a small New England college. There are 4 characters: a thin, graying professor of history named George, his wife Martha, described by the author as ample but not fleshy, and a young biology instructor named Nick and his wife Honey. Here are some of the stage directions for our professor friend George. Moves to the portable bar, gazes into her drink, takes her drink, moves to the portable bar, makes drinks, returns with drinks, returns to the portable bar, goes to the portable bar, moves back to the portable bar, re-enters with liquor, breaks a bottle against the portable bar, takes his glass to the bar, goes to the portable bar, moves to the bar, moves to the bar again, and so forth, on through a long but absorbing night on a New England college campus. Of course, much more happens that night than the professor's trips to the bar, and therefore I don't suppose that my wife should have been surprised when a young man stopped her one day last year and asked, "Mrs. Rudolph, why is it when we come out to your house for an evening, we don't play the games they do in Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf?" Any search for an understanding of what teaching is and has been will of course be complicated by fiction and by caricature, but it will even be complicated and unnecessarily confused by the existence of professors who act like the caricatures and fictionalized versions of themselves served up by novelists and dramatists. At Cornell, for instance, there is a professor who drinks his soup through a straw in order to be free to read the New York Times at lunch. Everywhere, presumably including UCLA, nature imitates art and thereby compounds our difficulty. But one thing is pretty certain: professors and teaching aren't what they used to be. In a remarkable coincidence that should have served as a warning to professors everywhere, there appeared one Sunday last spring in both the New York Times and the National Observer a vigorous complaint against college faculties. The complaint is not altogether new, but the context is, and whatever justification there may be or may not be for the complaint, there is something refreshing in learning that while of course we professors are guilty of subverting the young, the troubles lie not in the risks that are run in exposing them to us. Not at all. It is charged instead that we subvert the young men and women of our colleges and universities by neglecting them. The new president of the University of Rochester, W. Allen Wallace, warned in the Observer that the modern university is in danger of becoming a hotel keeper for transient scholars and projects, a kind of standardized Hilton through whose rooms flow professors on their way to and from various outposts of the world, libraries and laboratories. Professors doing the bidding of the foundations, governments, and industries that will pay for the observations, interpretations, and conjectures on which contemporary academic life so largely feeds. And all this very often has very little to do with students. As Edward T. Hall, headmaster of the Hill School, reported in the Times on the same day, the one change I have noticed on college campuses, with few exceptions, since World War II, is the virtual abdication by many, if not most faculty members, of their non-academic responsibility toward undergraduates. These rumblings in the press have dictated the central theme of my remarks this afternoon: the role of the professor in the age-old struggle for primacy in American higher education between piety and intellect, between character and mind. In this struggle, more than anywhere else, we are most likely to come to some understanding of what has happened over the years to teaching in the American college and university. As an aside, however, perhaps I should point to a few constants, to a few ways in which teaching has apparently not changed at all. How to teach, for instance, is something that American colleges have pretty much always assumed to be something that cannot or need not be learned. In the old days, young men might prepare themselves to be clergymen and end up as teachers. Today, they prepare themselves to be scholars and end up as teachers. The consequence is the same, a profession without professional preparation or standards. Instead, a kind of mystique, compounded of a bit of Mark Hopkins in the log, a nod to teaching as an art, perhaps as something strangely and wonderfully inborn, maybe even a bit about learning on the job. In any case, hardly anyone in the history of American higher education has ever been ready or prepared to teach. Willing and glad, perhaps, but not ready. Another constant has been the remarkable ignorance by college teachers of the conditions that encourage learning. In the old days, college professors adhered to an altogether inadequate and almost entirely inaccurate psychology of learning. Today, it is my impression that on the whole, they adhere to no psychology of learning at all. The consequence is the same. Much is taught that is never learned. But aside from these two constants, and you may wish to take issue with me about them, aside from these, a historical look at college and university teaching in the United States tells us a story of great change. For once upon a time, the colleges were populated by a breed of professors lacking professional ambition, dedicated with a touching sincerity to the souls and character of the young men and women who fell under their instruction. In those years before the Civil War, as I have pointed out elsewhere, among the simple and somewhat romantic figures of a much simpler day, among the steamboat captains, the Yankee peddlers, the mountain men, the yeoman farmers, the village blacksmiths, there were also the college professors. Notable among them was Professor George Bladerman, German-born professor of modern languages at the University of Virginia, who in 1840 was dismissed from the Virginia faculty after having twice during the previous week beaten his wife. And there was also his perplexed successor, a Hungarian wanderer, Charles Kreutzer, who also was dismissed. Kreutzer, whose overpowering wife often turned him out of the house at night, once lamented, "The board of visitors were gentlemen whom it was hard to please. They had kicked Dr. Bladerman out because he had whipped his wife, and they have kicked me out because I had been whipped by my wife. What did they really want?" A good question. And it has seemed to me that what the American college really wanted was someone like Alpheus Packard, who taught for 65 happy years at Bowdoin, and there earned a reputation as a Christian gentleman. Someone like Julian Sturdivant, who was appointed the first member of the faculty of Illinois College in 1829, and who enjoyed a tenure of 56 years before his retirement in 1885. The old American college wanted and revered men like Professor Fletcher March, who in 1866 hauled manure all one day that the grounds of Denison College would be made more beautiful. Men of all work like John Smith of Dartmouth, whose appointment made him professor of English, Latin, Greek, Chaldee, etc., and such other languages as he shall have time for. Among professors such as these, the colleges located that effective religious impulse, that kindly paternalism, that moral rectitude on which their best intentions rested. For one thing, only rarely were the professors scholars. They were recruited instead from men who believed that in serving the cause of knowledge and truth by promoting liberal education, they were first of all serving the cause of religion. Indeed, many had hoped to be active clergymen, but for reasons of health had turned to what was considered the less demanding occupation of teaching. So, the old-time college professor was often a clergyman or had at least some theological training. He also was prepared to indulge in a kind of psychological, if not physical, expatriation. As long as the clergy were the most esteemed figures in the community, the clergyman teacher and the teacher were not isolated from the main currents of American life. But even in the day of the old-time college, the clergyman was being surpassed in public esteem by the squire, the successful businessman, the lawyer-politician, the man of affairs. The professor became someone who was not fully participating in American life, someone who stood aside while red-blooded Americans sought the main chance. This professorial attitude was symbolized by the willingness, almost the eagerness of those good Christians to be exploited by their employers. For the pattern of low faculty salaries, a pattern that helped to create a profession that was not expected and finally not permitted to enjoy or to aspire to the ordinary pleasures and living standards elsewhere defining American life. This pattern rested in part on a certain sense among the professors of Christian sacrifice, which invited martyrdom on the altar of Christian learning. Your professorial predecessors looked upon their inadequate salaries as evidence of the ways of a society that had mixed its values, or they accepted them as being adequate enough in the fleeting life of this world. This divorce from the world, which was nothing less, it seems to me, than a rejection of the enterprising, exploiting, self-seeking, but nonetheless creative qualities of American life. This divorce would not recommend the professors to their students, or increasingly to their students' fathers, and to the governing boards as well. There grew up in this country a sense of wonder and a sense of the untouchable about college professors. Not so much because they were teachers, but because apparently they were willing to be teachers without regard to that stuff that has been terribly important in symbolizing status in a tremendously mobile society, by which, of course, I mean money. It must have been difficult, if not impossible, for a first-rate tycoon or a state legislator or merely an aspiring Horatio Alger hero to understand or respect college professors, all those nice guys who apparently chose to finish last. The old-time professors, however, were in every sense adornments of the liberal tradition, holding to the values expressed by a spokesman of your collegiate ancestor, the College of California, in 1868, and I quote, "This then is our purpose, to make men more manly and humanity more humane, to augment the discourse of reason, intelligence, and faith, and to kindle the beacon fires of truth on all the summits of existence." Here is a statement couched in helpful ambiguity, lacking in priorities, but all the same recognizing the commitment of the professors to the whole man, to what Mark Hopkins of Williams in his inaugural address of 1836 described as an active being that must be strengthened to think and to feel, to dare, to do, and to suffer. This view of the purpose of higher education, this view of the student himself as central to his own course of study, is also central to the tradition of liberal learning. It rests upon a recognition that at college the gnawing question, the central question, is the student's constant search for some understanding of who he is, where he came from, where he is going. It postulates a world of students who are prepared to be reminded by their teachers of the burden, the joy, the responsibility of their humanity, eager for the perspectives that correct the distortions that inevitably enter into private, individual views of the world, willing to be faced with as much truth as they can bear, and perhaps more, seeking to exchange innocence for wisdom. We are no longer certain that going to college is always an invitation to such an experience. In fact, we have come to recognize that for many students and teachers in many institutions, such an experience is neither possible nor desired. How did we get here? When and where and why did teaching in an American college shift, and how much, from the liberal concern with man to the specialized concern with vocation, or the predominant concern with mind. The development of values, as distinct from the development of doctors and lawyers and dietitians and homemakers, and as distinct from the training and sharpening of minds, was sustained in the early American college by a combination of powerful supports, by a clear preference of the professors themselves, by that whole package of practices known as the collegiate way, and by all those tendencies of the national culture that may be described as anti-intellectual. The old-time college revealed its commitment to character, its preference for piety over intellect in many ways. For example, the numerical grades the professors recorded on student report cards were based on a combination of merits earned in the classroom and demerits earned in the dangerous business of living. If, for any of many reasons, a student misbehaved, he suffered as one of the punishments the loss of some previously earned credit on the intellectual scale of merit. Intellect and character were thereby closely linked, but the professors made no secret as to their own priorities. They gave little encouragement to intellectual activity that was not strongly protected from arrogance and worldliness by Christian nurture. A Dartmouth president expressed a characteristic outlook in 1828, and I quote, "The very cultivation of the mind has frequently a tendency to impair the moral sensibilities, to induce that pride of conscious ability and variety of attainment which are affectations offensive to God." An Amherst president revealed his distaste for, and I quote, "irreligious men, mere philosophers and scholars." And a member of his faculty encouraged his students to believe that to have prayed well is to have studied well. The depth of this commitment and the vitality of it cannot be exaggerated, for long after intellectual purpose moved into ascendancy on the American campus, the preference for character remained. The college's commitment to character was supported by a tradition of customs and institutions known as the collegiate way. The collegiate way rests on the certainty that a curriculum is not enough to make a college. It is respectful of quiet rural settings, dependent on dormitories, committed to dining halls, permeated by paternalism. Every American college has had it, or consciously rejected, or lost or sought to capture it, or moved out of a city in order to maintain it. The collegiate way is the Board of Trustees of the University of North Carolina in 1842, asking the governor of the state to address the students on the importance of neatness. It is a Princeton alumnus conveying the meaning of Princeton by describing it as a place where each man may enter dozens of rooms whose doors are never locked, nor their tobacco jars empty. In the mythology of the collegiate way, the college was a large family sleeping, eating, studying, worshiping together under one roof. The claims made for it were certainly extravagant. But who could deny that association with one's peers in the close communal life of the college gave to students a new standard of self-measurement, one which eased the liberation from home and facilitated the assumption of manhood. The kindly paternalism, the rationale of professorial discipline and guidance was what made a college. President Smith of Dartmouth in 1873 insisted that he even had proof, and this at a time when Cornell was creating a university where there were few rules, no paternalism at all. President Smith reported, "Earnest young men crave real guidance. They welcome a proper system of compulsion and restraint. One of our students was led a year or two since by a certain blare of trumpets to leave Dartmouth and to enter Cornell. After a time he has returned. 'What has brought you back?' I asked as he applied for readmission. 'Oh,' said he, 'I would rather be where there is more discipline.'" The purposes of the collegiate way were perhaps indeed best served by this pattern of discipline and paternalism, whether in the conscious ordering of the college regimen or in the informal relationships that grew up between faculty and student. The function of collegiate paternalism was clearly explained by President Nisbet of Dickinson College in a letter to the parents of one of his charges in 1792. And I quote, "A parent cannot but be anxious when his child is at a distance from him and exposed to dangers of different kinds. But as in education a certain risk must be run in order to gain a certain advantage, every good parent as well as every good teacher ought to be satisfied when he is taking the best means for preserving the morals of his child as well as for improving his understanding. Your son is well, though some of our students have troubles with colds and sore throats." In this tradition, a president of Brown wrote to one mother in 1812, "Though I have examined the case, I cannot find that Henry is addicted to gambling." And to a father, "I've requested your son not to contract any other debts without my knowledge, for I find that the value of money has not yet engaged his attention." It's from this tradition that we have so many deans these days, as a matter of fact. President Greene of Princeton tried the custom of inviting 8 undergraduates at a time to his home for dinner, but he concluded that the collegiate way could not really compete effectively with natural depravity. "I found that it had but little effect in reclaiming the vicious," was his verdict on his dinner experiment. Paternalism could have a beneficial effect on students, however, as one young man at Dartmouth revealed. He wrote home, "I like to hear our president pray. I like to hear him say, 'The Lord bless these young men, every one of them,' for then I feel safe for the day." One would only have had to see the student Sidney Lanier tramping in the woods about Oglethorpe in Georgia, playing his flute and conversing at length with Professor James Woodrow, to know that faculty-student relations could be one of the strongest agencies for the nurture of values and character in college students. Such relations were greatly aided by the abandonment of strict codes of discipline and of the Puritan view of man as permanently depraved, and a substitution for this view by what I would call the treat them like gentlemen school. In a statement on the psychology of the new approach, President Knott of Union in 1854 revealed the extent to which a college's discipline policy was an aspect of its fundamental concern with the inculcation of right values. I quote, "Little reliance has been placed on appeals to the principle of fear. Emulation has been appealed to. Moral and religious instruction, the sense of honor, and the love of knowledge have been principally relied on, whilst the chief concern has been to teach the young men to bring themselves under the rule of inward principle rather than of outward fear and restraint." The collegiate way helped to establish the philosophic and historical foundation for many of the non-intellectual purposes of the American college. The values that it cherished helped to restrain the intellectual potential of American higher education. It lent itself to the idea that college professors could be agents of moral regeneration among the young, and it would account for the fact that no American institution of higher learning can be an intellectual agency alone. But in the meantime, the traditional college of liberal orientation, the college where character and values mattered most, was being transformed or bypassed by the dramatic intrusion of 2 new teaching purposes, the one intellectual and scientific, the other popular and vocational. The new influence of Germanic scholarship and the pursuit of scientific truth were most dramatically symbolized by the opening in 1876 of our first great PhD factory at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. The rise of Cornell, the land-grant colleges, and the great state universities of the Middle West, on the other hand, revealed a new concern with practical learning, the kind that prepared men for careers in a remarkably dynamic industrial society. While neither of these new purposes was intentionally hostile to a concern with characters and values, both necessarily required that teachers place their emphasis elsewhere. For the acceptance of revealed religious truth, the professors at the new university in Baltimore substituted a search for scientific truth. For preparation for life in the next world, they substituted a search for an understanding of this world. The professors at Johns Hopkins and at all the institutions that caught its spirit elevated man's reason to a position it had not before attained in the United States. They released the energies of scholarship, combined them with the national impulse to human betterment and material progress, and in doing so, helped to promote the nurture of intellect rather than character as an aim of education. A similar function was performed by the spirit of vocationalism that was unleashed by the professors at the land-grant colleges and institutes of technology, which responded to the rapidly accumulating knowledge of a technical nature which required some orderly synthesis, and to the requirements of a complex industrial society with its needs for experts of the most specialized sort. American higher education thereupon welcomed potential merchants, journalists, manufacturers, chemists, teachers, inventors, artists, musicians, pharmacists, scientific farmers, engineers. The courses of study that were developed by the professors to serve this bewildering array of careers differed greatly from the course of liberal studies in which the central subject was man himself. The new courses and the new professors tended to emphasize the study of things. They raised questions not so much about man's ultimate role and his ultimate responsibility as they did about whether this or that was a good way to go about achieving some immediate and limited practical goal. In this environment, the old concern with values and character was subjected to neglect. The shifting aims of higher education were sometimes recorded dramatically, sometimes almost unnoticeably. In 1868, when Williams College was looking for a professor of chemistry, it considered Arthur Wright, who in 1861 had received from Yale one of the first 3 PhD degrees awarded by an American university. President Woolsey's letter of recommendation from New Haven observed, and I quote, "There is one drawback. He was supposed when we elected him tutor to be skeptical. I regard him as probably a Christian in difficulty. I have no doubt he would teach chemistry better than it is taught here in New Haven." Williams cast its vote for chemistry rather than piety, and Arthur Wright was hired in 1868. In 1869, the Harvard faculty ended the long tradition whereby course grades and delinquency demerits have been combined in ranking students. Henceforth, students were graded only on their classroom work. At Bowdoin in the 1870s, the student newspaper reported 3 members of the faculty at the prayer meeting, 4 at the dance across the walk. By 1902, at the good, sound Presbyterian College of Worcester in Ohio, a visiting college president could announce, "Piety will never atone for intellectual inefficiency." The old collegiate paternalism declined. The professors increasingly committed their lives to their professions, adopting the Germanic tradition of non-involvement with student life. The growth of intellectual and vocational purpose varied from institution to institution and among kinds of institutions. The liberal tradition of concern with values and character assumed a residential situation, and institutions that have lacked that situation have had perhaps the most difficulty in fulfilling this oldest of teaching purposes. The question of teaching aims and priorities is once more upon us today, however, only partly because of the variety of kinds of institutions that serve higher education in the United States. We have also been made tremendously aware of the accelerating commitment to intellectual purpose that has permeated the whole structure of American education. The attacks on the schools and on progressive education by Admiral Rickover and others in the 1950s, the increasing selectivity in college admission, our maturing as a nation, but mostly the shocking discovery that the Russians had harnessed intellectual energy and outdistanced us in a host of ways. All these have brought intellectual purpose as an educational aim to its highest moment of prestige. By 1960, we had been led to the recognition and pursuit of intellectual excellence by the Rockefeller brothers, the head of the Carnegie Corporation, and by numerous educational spokesmen who would hurry us on our way to victory over the Russians. Within a year, however, the signs of a reaction began to appear. Questions were raised not only about the reliability of college entrance examination scores, but also about their suitability in determining who should go to college. Wesleyan in Connecticut announced that students dropped for academic reasons had higher test scores than students to whom it awarded degrees. The president of Colorado College wrote an article in the Saturday Review entitled, "The Trouble with Excellence." Williams College announced in effect that it was going to experiment by admitting a certain percentage of freshmen who would not be able to meet its spiraling academic standards for admission. Rather strange situation, it seems to me. But we're now accepting one out of every freshman on the basis that he can't meet our requirements. A voice, and it's a good idea, a voice from Cambridge warned that if present-day academic standards had been enforced 60 years ago, or even 25 years ago, Franklin Roosevelt and John Kennedy would have had to govern this country without the benefit of a Harvard degree. And at Princeton, the alumni took the editors of the Tiger by the scruff of the neck and told them to stop being so intellectual and get back to the business of being funny. The evidence is overwhelming, it seems to me, that we are quite bewildered by this pursuit of intellectual purpose that has been thrust upon us, and that, among other things, we are worried about what kind of men and women are going to possess these highly trained intellectual powers. Will they have any aesthetic judgment, any taste? Will we be able to talk of their excellence of character as readily as we talk of their intellectual excellence? Will they be able to contribute as much to the quality of American life as to the quantity of intellectual power that may be brought to bear on a concrete problem? Will they be sensitive to what is human about man? Will they be compassionate as well as bright, individual as well as intellectual? Teachers in the American college and university must ask these questions. They must also exert their energies in their imaginations in achieving the right answers. And clearly, no college or university will achieve the right answers unless it harbors within its faculty a profound respect for the questions themselves, a respect that we are so very certain that the old-time professors would have had. But let's face it, the old-time professor is just about as available and as quaint as rock candy, the Model T, railroad service. With the ascendancy of university ideals, even in the colleges, the old-time professor was gradually but persistently replaced by the new men with the PhD, that label of academic respectability, that mark of professional competence, with its assurance of a certain standard sameness of training, experience, and exposure to the ideals and rules and habits of scientific scholarship. In the 1880s and the 1890s, academic institutions set up their ladders of status achievement, thereby organizing, as never before in the groves of academe, a competitive drive. The creation of a hierarchy of professors, associate professors, assistant professors, instructors, was a function in the first place of that awesome proliferation of knowledge which enlarged the scope of a particular area of human understanding and required the labors of 2 or 3 men where one had once sufficed, and second, of that ever-increasing undergraduate and graduate enrollment, which in some places called for platoons of instructors, where also one had once sufficed. To this apparatus of hierarchy was also added the concept of departmentalization, a symbolic statement of the disunity of knowledge which was never made by the old colleges. Departmentalization was not only a method of organizing an otherwise unwieldy number of academic specialists into the framework of collegiate government, it was also a development that unleashed all that competitiveness, that scrambling for students, that pettiness and jealousy, which in some of its manifestations have made the teacher's life very much like other forms of organizational life. The specialization which this departmentalization was intended to accommodate encouraged a set of emphases and values that was foreign to the old-time college. For that catholicity of outlook and acquaintance with universal knowledge, which had seemed so often to be a mark of the best of the old-time professors, there was substituted a specialist regard for the furthest refinements of one's own interests. One critic of the New Order complained, and I quote, "One of the most instructive sights imaginable is a college professor digging up the upper skull and lower canine tooth of a Neanderthal man. It is a contrast between growth and petrification, the Neanderthal man representing growth." Publication became a guiding interest of the new academician. Each book, each article paved the way to promotion. In 1909, the Athletic Research Society held a meeting at which coaches and athletic directors read research papers. The transfer of emphasis from teaching to research was nowhere better revealed than in a conversation that was reported in 1909, and the conversation has taken place many times since. "I took occasion not long ago," wrote Abraham Flexner, "to ask a college dean who was the best teacher in his institution. He named a certain instructor. This conversation followed. What is his rank? Assistant professor. When will his appointment expire? Shortly. Will he be promoted? No. Why not? He hasn't done anything." All this apparatus, these manifestations of organization, this de-emphasis of teaching, were a tremendous boon to the academic itinerant, for whom a reputation in his profession was more important than any commitment to a particular institution or its students. The tendencies of the new scholarship and of organization made such a man loyal to professional standards and to the processes and attributes of organization, but often indifferent to the fate of the institution to which he might temporarily be attached, and indifferent even to the fate, moral or intellectual, of unknown students who passed through the lecture halls. For although one might be a most excellent teacher, and although effective teaching might lead untold students to self-discovery and self-mastery, the organization demanded something else. It fed on research, it regurgitated research, it promoted research. Yet lest I be misunderstood, let me insist that the rise of the academician, the organization of professors and learning in all the ways that I've suggested, and there are many others, was essential to the achievement of intellectual maturity by this country. There were losses in personal security and psychological certainty when the college professor underwent professionalization and organization. But there were also magnificent gains, the tremendous conquest of ignorance, the sheer increase in the number of Americans for whom intellectual pursuits brought pleasure, and the harnessing of knowledge for the service of man. The old-time professor would not have appreciated the technique of teaching developed by Professor Harris of Amherst, who made his lectures intentionally incomprehensible on the grounds that really interested students would stop after class for further instruction. The old-time professor would have sympathized with the Yale undergraduate who in 1923, commenting on the lecture courses that had become standard fare, when that Yale man lamented, "Instead of being a person, I am now merely a suit of clothes pinned together by 4 or 5 seat numbers." The new professors, it is true, had their own orientation, their own set of peculiarities, but life for them was no more a matter of solace and double serving than it had been for the old-time professors. Intellect rather than piety was their touchstone, and ignorance was their particular challenge. What distinguished them from their predecessors was a deep-seated dedication to the advancement of learning. Out of their devotion, there developed standards of freedom and tenure, affecting the capacity of the American college and university to support effectively the life of the mind. As we look at the American college and university today, we have every reason to be disturbed. All the tendencies that 75 years ago were undermining the teaching function, all the tendencies that were breaking down a community of interest among teachers and students, all of the tendencies that accounted for the thrust toward intellect and away from character as the locus of a teacher's concern, all these tendencies are greatly accelerated in the present. The professor is no longer the self-effacing, sacrificing Christian who was accustomed to use and abuse. There are signs that in time the American college professor is even going to be paid a salary commensurate with his training, his importance, and his usefulness. All this means that he will do those things necessary to receive the rewards. And while colleges and universities have succeeded in perfecting methods of measuring the results of scholarship and research, the measurement of teaching has defied both man and machines. The career-oriented professional professor is a less reliable support of the liberal tradition of humane learning than was the old-time professor. The vocational-oriented university and the non-residential junior and community colleges provide a less reliable climate for the development of fruitful faculty-student relations. And the professor himself has succeeded so much in emancipating himself from the narrowing confines of a single campus that he will perhaps never again be the character who endeared himself to generations of students, the character whose only badge was an honest face and whose only uniform was a rumpled, baggy old suit of clothes. I do not mean to be alarming. I'm very glad to be here today away from my campus. Nor do I suggest that there are no teachers anymore. I do mean that the teacher who cares about the whole student, the teacher who sees a man as well as a mind, such a teacher is harder to find. And it is harder for such a teacher to withstand the forces that would reward him for abandoning this commitment. The great increase in the college teaching force has brought into the market ambitious, upwardly mobile young men and women who mean to get ahead and who have only to look around them to recognize that getting ahead very often has very little to do with students. We all know that the teacher with the greatest prestige is the one who doesn't teach at all. Also, the integration of academicians into our society, charted by the increasing demands placed upon professors by business, government, and the great foundations, this integration lessens the institutional commitment of the professors. It often develops in them a lack of sympathy with and understanding of the young. The availability of government and foundation funds, especially in the sciences, reorients the professor from his student as a man to a student as a research partner. Now, all this is not bad, and there's much good in it. It is from the good that we will have to work and develop. In the first place, there is surely an untold benefit in at last having a self-respecting profession of college teachers. Men and women who can look their children in the eye without feeling a sense of guilt for having sacrificed them to the poverty and scorn that have traditionally been visited upon college professors. There is even a certain gain in faculty-student relations for a professor to be able to encourage a student to think seriously of an academic career without running the risk of feeling responsible for ruining the young man's life and of certainly being considered a damn fool by the boy's father. Mothers have always been different, and for reasons that would be worth looking into. They learned first that man does not live by bread alone. And the campus is a better place, and so is the world, if professors flow in and out of it, enlarging their experiences and vicariously those of their students, destroying much of the provincialism, smugness, and meaningless devotion to tradition that have been characteristic of American higher education at its worst. The struggle between character and intellect can be expected to continue. Some institutions and some teachers more than others will succeed in making the best of both traditions, of harnessing a long experience of regarding young men and women as human beings, and of meeting the challenge of intellectual commitment that our maturity as a nation and our wisdom as a people demand of us. The demand for college and university teachers will be so great in the years ahead that you need not fear for the availability of jobs. You will be in a seller's market, and therefore perhaps more in a position to determine what kind of teacher you will be than you are now prepared to believe. I know of one teacher who recently was having difficulty getting administrative approval for a rather challenging and interesting idea for a course in American history. He wanted to see what would happen to American history if Negroes were included. He won his point partly because administrators want to keep professors happy these days, and partly because his argument was hard to beat. Look, he said, if I wanted to write a book, you would give me the time off and help me to find the necessary money. And if I didn't want to be here at all, you'd give me a leave of absence. Now, what I want to do is teach. Can't you find any money for that? As you enter on careers in teaching, you should remember, it seems to me, that you will have a rather considerable authority over the forces that shape your own lives. At first, this may not seem so, but you ought to try very hard to listen to what your experiences tell you about your own preferences in these struggles between mind and character, between research and teaching, that occupy the profession of college teaching. A teacher's first years will not necessarily determine his fitness for the world he has chosen to inhabit, but he will be tested in many small ways. These are tests that one neither passes nor flunks. They simply register what one needs to know about oneself. Very early in my teaching, a student who apparently had read one of those periodic laments on the inadequacies of faculty salaries exclaimed to me after class one morning, "Sir, do you realize that my father pays the groom of my horse more than you are paid?" Now, what did I do? Did I resent this boy and his father and his groom, all of whom, by the way, lived in California? Did I nurse his remarks as a wound or cherish them as a priceless treasure? Well, I've done many things with them, but one of the first was to share them with my colleagues, among whom was your associate dean. And into the past, he reached for the tradition that has comforted me these many years. Listen to the words, said Dr. Curtis, of Roger Ascham, tutor to Queen Elizabeth, who observed in 1570, and then he quoted, "Pity it is that commonly more care is had, yea, and that among very wise men, to find out rather a cunning man for their horse than a cunning man for their children." The world is full of sorrow, hate, ignorance, misunderstanding, most of it calling not for hate and ignorance and misunderstanding in return, but for pity, for sorrow, and understanding. If we are fortunate, we grow out of or fall out of our playpens, and so do our children. And the consequences have much to do with growing up. And of course, this is what education and teaching are all about. Yet it is a painful calling, and always will be. We need Edith Hamilton's sobering reminder that there has never been a generation better educated than the one that ushered in the end of Athens. And we need Andre Siegfried's wise observation. The average American, he said, has a supreme belief in education. More mature nations have realized that there are things that cannot be learned. Even so, there is much to be done. Do you remember the anguished cry from the floor of the House of Representatives during the annual debate on foreign aid a few years ago? "We send them books," cried the bewildered congressman, "and they burn the libraries. We send them our vice president, and they throw rocks at him." there is much to be done. Good luck, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Rudolph. We have some time for some questions, if there are any from the floor. Who has a query? Well,
We've got so many job offers.
yes, sir.
Well, you'll find some of that in my book. The rest of it is ephemeral.
You might be interested in knowing that the poet Chaucer, not yet having written extensively to be sure, was ransomed by the King of England for a price less than he paid for the ransom of his royal steed.
Thank you very much.
Anyone else?
I was wondering, your opinion, whether you think reforms in teaching procedures need to come from faculties themselves or from administrators with strong overviews.
Well, if the implication of that question is that faculties are a great drag on progress, you're quite right. I've often held the view that boards of trustees are what keep colleges from doing things, but it's because I was in a college where nobody had been trying to do anything, and we've always assumed it was the board of trustees. But the minute some people on the faculty decided that it would be interesting to try to do something, then we discovered it was really the faculty that helped things, kept things from happening. The trouble with turning it over to administrators is that it doesn't work, that the faculties become more entrenched and so forth. So it just takes time. I don't know, I'm interested in the whole question of innovation in higher education, and I gather you are too. And I come from a campus where, much to the surprise of the world, we're in the process of getting rid of fraternities. And it's amazing how many other things you can do once you've done something as big and bold as that. I mean this seriously. Everything is now loose. We're able to. We've got a whole new notion about how many hours there are in the day, for instance. The Board of Trustees has discovered that it has taken the most painful decision in its history and has survived. Maybe it can take some more painful decisions. But I'm not helping you in your question. My impression is that, one of the things that's happening in my college is the students are getting so good that we just can't treat them the way they used to be treated. And it's the students who are creating the changes. The faculty cannot continue to meet students 3 times a week for 50 minutes and feed them habit. So the 50-minute class is disappearing. And it's not because the faculty thought that this was a brilliant idea. They heard of them. Students began to, maybe not come to class.
Have you thought of any ways to judge the teaching skill or teaching quality of a professor?
You mean some organized way? But I'm not an administrator. I think it's very difficult. I can look back over my years of teaching. I know it's my bad years and my good years, I think. But You know, one of the things that's often used as an indication is, well, how does the professor stand in the poll of the senior class on favorite professor or best course or whatever? I don't know whether you do that sort of thing here. I don't know how useful it is. I know that some campuses, the presidents check on Phi Beta Kappa to get some view of who ought to be promoted. That's all right when I'm glad about who's Phi Beta, but if I'm not happy about the current crop of Phi Betas, I don't think, I don't like that as a way. There's a grapevine on college campuses, university campuses. Good students make known who they think are good teachers. There's another way, of course, is to get the chairman of the department, who may not be a good teacher at all, to sit in on the courses of instructors and decide who the good teachers are. I think that probably succeeds in making very nervous young men more nervous. But it's used in some places before promotions are. I don't know what, are there any techniques here, just the usual?
I think there's a widespread interest on the campus in trying to find some way of student evaluation of instructors. And if we have any wisdom to shed on that, this would be appreciated.
Well, this is student interest. It exists on our campus. I mean, our student government recently said that it felt that it ought to have a role in appointments and promotions. It's something the faculty would like to have more to do with.
What do you think this will do to the standards, and do you think it's necessary?
2 years of compulsory higher education?
Yes.
Oh, I think we're going to get 2 years at least of higher education for everybody of the right age without any compulsion at all, because there isn't going to be anything else we can do with people. And I mean that very seriously. I think that automation requires that we keep young people out of trouble and in college. And this is developing at, the rate of enrollment in colleges is keeping right up with automation. And finally, I don't know where we go from there, but there's always outer space. No, I don't think there'll be any need for compulsion. Seriously, most everybody's going to go to college. Anybody have the current statistics?
47%.
What's that?
47% have been in college at one time.
Right now. Just look at what's this magnificent campus. What was here 20 years ago?
Those peas, beans, and barley.
I guess there would be an advantage of these meetings, universities and colleges are so very large. It's hard to affect very much of the change, really. And I wondered what would be the advantage, or would there be an advantage, setting up very small and experimental schools that could be open to all the various suggestions and criticisms, so that practice things could be in a practical situation, so that you could see how it would work.
Isn't Santa Cruz going to try everything anybody's ever suggested?
This sort of situation would have most likely sort of buzz sessions where you simply are just completely open to all various types of ideas and things.
Experimentation is one of the things that all these scientific-oriented experimenters don't like to do with education. I find what you're suggesting is an excellent idea. We take, again, my college, which we can't set it up again. It's there. But there's a hostility to experiment because the first argument is it'll change everything. And there's always a feeling that nobody's ever figured out how you can try something out on a small group instead of ruining the freshman class, only ruin 5% of them. So we're working on them in small groups now, ruining them in a way that we haven't been able to before.
Any other questions? If not, then we'll call it a vote. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.